Yeah.
So thank you very much for giving me the opportunity. Is it okay?
Yeah, I can hear you now. Sorry.
Okay, thanks. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunities to present my work. I'm going to talk about our predictive coding account for the cognitive development. I have been working in the development of robotics for 2 decades, and then we have found out that the neuroscience-inspired service called predictive coding provides a unified account for development for human children and robotics. And we have been designing the neural network model inspired by predictive coding theories. So first, my research motivation is to understand how human children acquire the cognitive abilities. We know that the human children are born with very immature capabilities. They don't even know what is their body and how they can control their body. But then in the first few years of life, they acquire many different types of cognitive abilities. For example, they're controlling their bodies in order to manipulate an object and read an intention of other persons and even cooperate with others. So the research question is, what neural mechanism may underlie the human cognitive development? We know that the children first acquire the non-social, more the self-oriented, their sensory motor capabilities. And then by applying and extending these abilities, they acquire the social, their cognitive functions. So the first question is, what the neural mechanism would drive the continuous development from non-social to social behaviors? And another interesting point is the individual diversity in the development. We know that some children show the typical trajectory in development, whereas some children show atypical patterns like an autism spectrum disorders. If there is a kind of principle for the neural mechanism of the cognitive development, this principle should be able to account for both their temporal continuity and the individual diversity in the development. So what can be the principle? And then we have looked at the neuroscience studies and then found that the predictive coding theory provides a unified account for the human brain. So which means that it might also explain the continuous development in the human children. The theory of predictive coding suggests that the brain works as a predictive machine. It does not simply receive their bottom-up sensory signal, but their internal model of their brain makes a prediction about the world. And this predicted signal from the internal model and their incoming sensory signals are integrated to calculate the prediction error, which must be minimized through the update of the internal model or by producing actions to change the world. And importantly, the process of minimizing the prediction error follows the Bayes theorem. The neuroscientists suggest that the prediction works as a plier of the Bayes theorem, whereas the sensation is considered as a likelihood. And the perceptions of the posterior is generated by integrating these two signals. And then there are differences between the typical development and their atypical development, like an autism spectrum disorder, seems to be accounted for by their differences in the precision of the prior predictions. According to their neuroscience theory, the persons with ASD seems to have their larger variances in the prior predictions. That is why their perception is often strongly relies on the incoming sensory signal, like a hypersensory sensitivity. This is a very nice starting point to discuss to what extent the predictive coding theory can account for their individual diversity and the temporal continuity of cognitive development. So we started designing the computational neural network model to test this hypothesis. The first study we looked at is an altruistic behavior, which is the type of the social behaviors. We know that the human children acquire the abilities of altruistic behavior at about 14 months old. But the question is how they can learn to infer the intention of other persons and also to make decisions about their action generations to make healthy behaviors. So to answer this question, we decided to implement the deep autoencoder, which can replicate the predictive processing in the brain. Here, the key idea is that the deep autoencoder is trained through the March model, the sensory motor experiences. In this experiment, the robot observed the visual signal as an input and also the tactile and the proprioceptive signal when the robot learns to reach for an object. And then, as you know, that as deep encoder is trained to reconstruct the original input signal as an output layer. So it follows the same ideas. And then the action production, the learning for action production itself is not so difficult. We can just apply the backpropagations to update the internal model. Here, the interesting point is that how this network can be utilized in prediction of another robot, the reaching behavior. Sorry. In the second stage, we introduced the green robot, another robot, where the group is only observing the green robot reaching. Observation of reaching behavior means the blue only the visual signal as an input, no tactile or no proprioceptive signal. But as deep was trained through March model, their sensory motor experiences, we could expect that this deep autoencoder can predict not only the visual signal, but also the tactile and the proprioceptive signal as an imaginary the sensation. And this imaginary, the sensory signal can be fed back to the network in order for the networks to make the further prediction for the visual and tactile proprioceptive signal. By using this, we can replicate the function of the mirror neuron system, which also utilizes the sensory motor experiences from their own the motor behaviors. So to test whether this idea works well, we have conducted experiments where we designed the two conditions. In one condition, we trained the network using their action generation experiences, which means that the network received the visual, tactile, and proprioceptive signal as an input and output to train the network. In the action observation condition, the network received only the visual signal. So the robot learned the network only through the observational experiences. I want you to look at the green bar, which shows the accuracy of the collect-go prediction of another robot, the reaching behavior. You can see that there only in the action generation condition, the network could acquire nicely their prediction ability. As learning proceeds, their accuracy of their correct prediction gradually improves. And the bottom, you can see the internal representation of the network. We apply the principal component analysis to visualize the middle layer, the internal representation of the middle layer. By comparing these conditions, you can see clearly that only the network which trained through the action generations acquired very nicely structured internal representation, which enabled robot to predict another robot's motor generations. And then in the second experiment, we looked at the representational drawing their abilities, which is also often used in the child developmental studies. In this scenario, the human user, parents, shows only the part of the drawing, and then we asked the robot to fulfill the missing parts of the drawing. In this case, the person gave only the circle, and then the robot tries to fulfill the missing parts. In this case, the circle corresponded to the face, so the robot now slowly adding their eyes and mouth in the end. So how these abilities was acquired by this robot? We utilized the recurrent neural network in this case to replicate the idea of predictive coding. Here, the key ideas, the feature of this predictive neural network is that this network predicts not only the mean of the signal, but also the variance of their predicted signal. This variance can be utilized to replicate the Bayesian inference idea, which I explained in the first part of my talk. This Bayes inference plays an important role in making their predictive coding in the brain and also showing their diversity between the individual. So we introduced the Bayesian inference module to verify whether there are modifications in the prior precision can account for the individual diversity in their cognitive behaviors. And then in these scenarios, we first train the network to reproduce 6 types of drawing with patterns. This is an XY trajectories. And then after training the 6 types of drawings, we tested the network by providing only the first 1/3 of the trajectory, only the contours of the face or contour of the house and so on. And then we let the network to make a prediction. First, let the network first infer the intended pattern from this first 1/3 of trajectories, and then let the network to make the predictions for the missing parts. You can also see how robots produces such an prediction abilities. First infer their intended patterns and then tries to fulfill the missing parts by utilizing the output of the network. And then our research question here was how the modifications of the prior precision would explain the individual diversity in the prediction abilities. So we introduced the one parameter here, h, which can be multiplied to the variance of the prediction. Here's the result. We manipulated h value, which is multiplied to the prior precision from the very low number to the very high number. First, let's look at the normal prior. In case the network utilized the predicted that precision as an input for the Bayesian module. So in this case, when the h equals to 1, the network was very successful in reproducing the missing parts. Here, the green lines corresponds to the fulfilled trajectory by the network. You can see that the 6 different patterns are nicely replicated by the predictions abilities of the network. And then when we changed the h parameter to the very high value, which means that the network had a very weak hypoplier. In this case, the network often showed a scribbling behavior as often observed in young children. Young children also have difficulties in fulfilling the missing parts, and we could replicate the similar scribbling behaviors by the hypoplier network. And then in case of hyperplier network, we often observe the misinterpretation of the intended patterns. For example, this trajectory in the middle intended for a car, but the network understood this pattern is like in a face because the outline was similar to the face. To see what caused the misinterpretation or scribbling behaviors, we analyzed the internal representation of the recurrent neural network. We again applied a PCA to visualize the internal representation of the network, and we found that only when the h equals to 1, the network could acquire very nicely structured internal representation, which resulted in the successful drawing behavior, whereas h was very small or very large, the network failed in acquiring the internal representation. This is explained why the network have replicated the individual diversity depending on the precision of the prior prediction. So let me quickly summarize what we could learn from this experiment. So based on the predictive coding ideas and also the Bayesian inference hypothesis, we could observe that the development can be accounted as an acquisition of the prior predictions. In the early stage of the development, the inference have very limited experiences. That's why the precision of the prior precision is also very low. And then the acquiring the more accurate plier prediction is considered as a proper and typical development in the children's. And then with this, the plier predictions, we could observe that there are proper perceptual abilities or the motor behavioral abilities in the typical development of children. And then we could also observe that how the social abilities can also emerge based on this base inference model. In case of social interaction, the babies can obtain only the limited sensory information from others. The children cannot access their internal representation of the person or even the sensory signal of another person. But then as if they acquired plier predictions, they can utilize the plier predictions to make an imaginary sensations like in a mirror neuron system. And this imaginary sensation allows them to make more precise perception about the world. We think that the mirror neuron system works in this way in order to help the children to acquire the more accurate the perceptual the signals based on the plier and the sensory informations. And then of course, the next questions is how it can also acquire the decision-making abilities. We have not addressed directly this ability yet. We can think that the minimization of prediction error would becomes their basic abilities for acquiring the decision-making. But the challenge here is that decision-making may not always reduce the prediction error or may require children to consider like reward, social feedback, and internal model of others. So our future extensions, we should address to extend our predictive coding model to integrate for example, reward-based predictions or hierarchical structure predictions, and also the inhibition mechanism make the robot not always to reduce the prediction error and so on. This is still future work, so I'm happy to receive your comments and the discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Yukie, for this great talk. I'm sorry each time I try to speak, I have a technical issue. Actually, for the conclusion, because it makes a link to the question I wanted to ask you. Because one of the motivation for the robot, as I understand, is trying minimize prediction errors. But are there situations where the robot has no control over the action and cannot minimize prediction error, and where a sense of agency could be useful to improve learning?
Yeah, I think the sense of agency can be also started with their acquiring the internal models of the prior predictions. And then once they acquire the prior predictions, which can account for that their body movement can be considered as coherent their events. And then they can again apply their prediction error minimizations to generate their agency, their behaviors. So I think that the discussion can be nicely also extended to their ideas.
Is there another question before we move on to the next talk? Well, it's already 4:20, so thank you very much again, Yukie. We'll continue the discussion tomorrow.